Next on Secrets of War. It was a tremendous booty, prized by Hitler as much as territory. The priceless art, personal assets, and national treasuries of an entire continent. The organized plunder of these riches would become the most enormous heist in the history of warfare. The trail of the spoils of war and Nazi gold is next on Secrets of War.
In every war endured by mankind, there's been economic plunder, war booty. No plunder, however, was as great or as well organized as that executed by Nazi Germany during World War II. From the moment he was democratically elected in 1933, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party lieutenants used their power to personally enrich themselves. Hitler ruled Germany with absolute power, enabling the Nazi regime to destroy its enemies and expropriate their property. Their system of organized pillage became the harbinger of the Third Reich and set the stage for the further plunder and subsequent genocide of the Jews and others across Europe. Heinrich Himmler's SS created a system of economic benefits for the leaders of the regime. The activities of the SS were to be self-financing. The main source of its revenue was to be the property of the enemies of the Third Reich, the fruits of their forced labor, and the proceeds from their eventual murder. Despite the real and imminent threat of severe punishment, some Germans, many of them Jews, some anti-Nazi industrialists, and some opposition politicians traveled to Swiss banks to hide and protect their assets from expropriation by the Nazis.
Swiss bankers played a role. I'm not just talking about the Swiss National Bank. Commercial banks knew full well which of their clients with certain Jewish last names had sizable assets, and sometimes there would be a situation where a very nervous client would come in with two very stocky gentlemen in ill-fitting suits, and these would be SS officers or guards, and they would quickly, hastily arrange a withdrawal of assets, and often what was happening was just sheer extortion.
To commit such violations of German law, Hitler needed accomplices in Switzerland's banking community.
What we see in the evolution of economic relations between Germany and Switzerland during the 1930s and 1940s is that Germany was traditionally Switzerland's most important economic partner.
Swiss financial institutions had long been closely tied to the German economy. They'd granted Germany more loans than financial institutions in other Western countries. With the rise of Bolshevism in the 1920s and 30s, Swiss banks became increasingly attractive to German clients as a place to make deposits. While the Swiss sought to expand their loan business throughout Europe, the relationship with Germany grew.
Before France's defeat, Switzerland's relations with its neighbors were relatively balanced. Although economically speaking, Germany's weight has always been more important than the other powers.
Plus important que les autres puissances.
The expropriated properties of Jews and other enemies of the Third Reich were not used solely for the public purse, but also to line the pockets of the Nazi elite.
Of Heinrich and so on and so. They had.
Professor Jean Ziegler is an outspoken, often controversial member of the Swiss parliament.
And putting money away. They became billionaires, you know, through the war. I mean, it was really a gangster logic, you know. They were not only murderers, it was a regime of the organized crime, you know.
It was not only stocks, bonds, jewelry, and gems that were stolen from the victims of the Reich. There were also works of art. The Germans used Swiss art dealers to help unload their ill-gotten gains. In particular, Swiss dealers were retained to sell what the Nazis termed degenerate art.
For the German, in the German ideology, everything that wasn't classical was a degenerate art. But as they were gangsters before everything, more than ideologists, they knew very well the value that it had on the small international market that was Switzerland. And so they sold many things through Switzerland.
Paris-based author Hector Feliciano has dedicated himself to the search for missing French art.
Hitler had such an enormous taste for art that he wanted, and he planned it during the war, he wanted to develop a big museum in Linz, which was the city where he had been raised as an adolescent, and he wanted to create this enormous museum that would be a museum of European art. The museum was supposed to, let's say, restructure all of art history into the Germanic point of view.
While Hitler concentrated on his museum, which was never built, he had other plans for the rest of Europe. The looting the Nazis had committed in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia prior to the start of the war had been quite profitable. Soon all of Europe would be ripe for the picking. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II had begun. The face of Europe and the history of the world would be changed forever. With the total war that was to rage throughout Europe came a shockingly systematic economic plunder. Occupation and the waging of war cost money. And Hitler was in need of further capital to expand his Reich.
Hitler had two problems. Even on the height of his power, he was dependent on the world market for the strategic raw material for the Wehrmacht, for the SS. He had to buy petrol, chrome from countries outside his sphere of influence. He needed money, convertible money, so he stole gold in 11 occupied countries.
Even before World War II broke out, Hitler had targeted the gold reserves of the countries his army eventually occupied. Officials of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, quickly followed the troops into Austria and Czechoslovakia to deplete their national treasuries. Once war broke out, the gold belonging to the rest of Europe's central banks was in Hitler's sights. There were plenty of riches available for the Third Reich to finance its war. Stealing the gold was only the first part. Then the Nazis had to launder it.
What the Swiss did was not only lend money and trade credits to the Nazis and their various puppet regimes, but actually assisted in the looting of national treasuries, which means that the central banks of the various countries that were occupied by the Nazi forces, be it Czechoslovakia, Poland, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the list goes on, the Reichsbank would quickly follow the Wehrmacht, the German army, into a town or the capital city and quickly go to the central bank, and hopefully they would find the national reserves, the gold reserves, and would simply loot it and send it off to the Reichsbank.
It was not just the gold of Europe's national treasuries that made its way to the Reichsbank. Jewish communities in Eastern territories were liquidated. Anything and everything belonging to these people was somehow turned into currency. Concentration camp victims were robbed of their dignity, their lives, and eventually their body parts, as long as the Nazis could find a way to use them. From slave labor in munitions factories to human hair used in the manufacture of submarine boots, the Nazis sought profit.
I mean, so many people behaved with such an incredibly disgusting way. One wouldn't have known what was this kind of mercantile approach of death that the Germans had. They had in mind to exploit to the end all the ownings. One could say that one of the reasons why they persecuted the Jewish was to take what they had. They were gangsters, and like the most organized gangsters that you can think. Hermann Göring was a gangster with an army of gangsters under him.
He stole the gold in the concentration camps, the tools, the gold fillings, the jewelry. And all this gold came to Berlin, smelted it, refound it again, marked by the swastika, and sent to Switzerland.
By the spring of 1940, the Third Reich had set its sights on the Western Front. After the Low Countries, France fell quickly.
They come into Paris in the summer of 1940, and in the first few days, they already have a list of some of the Jewish art dealers that were the most important in Paris. We have to remember that Paris was the center of the art world at the time. There was New York and London did not exist. So we see this enormous market with great collectors, great art dealers, and the Nazis, they arrive, and immediately, in 2 or 3 days, they take over about 15 or 16 galleries. The Jeu de Paume used to be the depot of all looted art that the Nazis used, okay? The trucks with all the looted artwork would come through here, then go up and go there, and there they would deliver all of their artwork. At the Jeu de Paume inside, there was a staff of some 60 people with art historians, art experts, photographers, and there they would take all of this art and start doing inventories. Some of it would go to Germany, and some of it would just be taken to Switzerland where it would be sold.
In wartime France, under the Vichy regime, there were plenty of government officials and art dealers eager to do business with the Third Reich.
We have to know that the Paris art market, being the biggest one in the world, with the war, all the international clientele, the British, the Americans, were cut off. So in fact, the Germans came to replace the former clients. And the art dealers who were there, they wanted to sell, they wanted to collaborate, they were very eager to collaborate. So a lot of them, they realized that all these looted collections are coming into the market. And they say, if I don't sell it, someone else will. Okay? And there is no ideology, there is no moral there.
Despite the complicity of many art dealers, gallery owners, agents, and government officials, there were some heroic acts to save art treasures from the Nazis.
There were some of the servants, let's say, of the Rothschilds, who managed to hide some of the art. And the thing is, there were even some, let's say, who did some even very complicated procedures in order to save it. One of the Rothschilds' mansions was taken over by one of Goering's deputy generals, okay? General Hanse. And the valet of the Rothschilds remained in the house, working for Hanse in order to save part of the objects. So what he did was he had a cousin who was a firefighter. So he calls his cousin and they sort of create a fake fire in one of the entrances.
There were two entrances to the Rothschild house. The German soldiers posted at the house tried to extinguish the fire along with the firemen. Meanwhile, the valet and his cousin carried pieces of priceless silverware and other artifacts out the other door. In spite of these heroics, the pillaging went on unabated.
They would go to great lengths to grab a piece of art that Goering wanted, or that Goebbels wanted, or that Hitler wanted.
They knew no rules. They felt it was their right to take what they could take. And people like Field Marshal Goering were simply insatiable when it came to art.
Goering was very much interested because he wanted to expand his own personal collection. During the war, he asked the finance ministry whether he can have foreign money, foreign currency. They tell him, we are in the middle of the war, we cannot give it to you. So he has the idea of using all of this looted art at the Jeu de Paume. And then they start selling it or bartering it. You would also get, in order to get into Switzerland, in order to get all this art into Switzerland, or part of it into Switzerland, they would use the diplomatic pouch in order to avoid customs.
Switzerland's status as a neutral country was respected and upheld throughout the war.
So the Swiss banks not only laundered the stolen money from the Nazi crime syndicate, they prolonged the war. There are very clear documents by Walter Funk, the Minister of Economy of the Reich and President of the Reichsbank, who says without the Swiss bankers we could not hold out more than 2 months.
Why then did the Swiss allow themselves to become so involved with so many illegal activities of the Nazi regime? The first reason was the constant threat of invasion. From the time Hitler moved into the Saar, into Austria, and then into Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the Swiss feared that the German-speaking part of their country would be the next target for annexation. In the year following these occupations, there was a great deal of planning by the Nazi High Command for the full-scale invasion of Switzerland.
Every evening, when I went to bed during the war, I asked myself, what happened tomorrow morning at 3 o'clock? Shall we be invaded?
In the early morning of the 25th of June, 1940, a few hours after the armistice between Germany and France went into effect, orders from the German Army High Command went out to prepare an invasion of Switzerland. The top-secret plan called for the quick defeat of any Swiss resistance and the partition of the country with Italy. Germany would take the northern 4/5 of the land, and Mussolini would occupy the remaining area south of a line running east from Lake Geneva. However, Operation Christmas Tree never took form, as the German war machine focused on other areas of Europe. It was late summer 1940, and Hitler had other priorities.
Remember that Switzerland was a landlocked country, completely dependent on the surrounding countries for the provision of fuel and other essential supplies. In the end, Hitler decided that it would cost too much to invade and to occupy the country, and in the end, he got most of what he wanted anyway by applying the kind of pressure that Germany was obviously in a position to apply.
Still, the threat of invasion never went away. The German press officially reminded Switzerland in 1942 that she was originally part of the Reich. Hitler called the neutral country a pimple on the face of Europe. Despite Hitler's saber-rattling, most Swiss people were fully committed to their neutrality and prepared to fight for it. Switzerland was a mountainous country with plenty of bases from which to launch guerrilla attacks. It would not be easy to conquer. Following the defeat of France in June 1940, the popularly elected Swiss General Henri Guisan called his senior officers together to plan a defensive strategy against a Nazi invasion. The Swiss could blow up the St. Gothard and Simplon tunnels as a defensive move. This would close off the main transit route for German supplies and arms to Italy. It would require an army of engineers to rebuild the tunnels, a difficult feat at any time, especially when under attack by roving guerrillas. The remaining Swiss army could then retreat to their mountain strongholds. These natural fortresses would would be next to impossible to bomb, even by the mighty Luftwaffe.
The defense was a general military service with armaments. The defense was principally in the Alps, because the landscape of the Alps is very good for defense. That makes the difference with Holland. Holland is flat. That is difficult to defend the country. But in Switzerland, that is also a tradition.
Despite this defensive strategy, a Nazi invasion would have eventually proved too much for General Guisan's forces.
The Swiss, I believe, in their day, said that we are no match for the Nazis, no match for the German army and air force. And if they don't like what we do, we'll be victims like all the rest of Europe.
Hitler continued to be troubled by Switzerland's persistent neutrality. In 1943, with the German armies on the defensive, Hitler closed ranks on those areas he firmly controlled. Switzerland remained the thorn in his side. The Germans were afraid that once the Allies invaded Europe, Switzerland would allow them free passage through Swiss territory. As a result, German army intelligence was reviewing plans for a preventive occupation. But Himmler and his SS were also keen to occupy Switzerland. Hitler's generals and economic advisors won the day by arguing against such a move. Many of them had fortunes locked away in Swiss banks, a violation of German law, and they wanted to keep them secret. This precarious strategic situation gave new meaning to Swiss neutrality.
There was a myth of Swiss neutrality before the war, and it continued after the war. And I think the Swiss themselves fostered the retention of that myth. They tried their very best to stay out of controversial issues.
The historical roots of Swiss neutrality can be traced to Swiss internal policy in the 16th century. Regional leaders were admitted into the Swiss Confederacy only after they'd made a pledge of strict neutrality in the event of disputes between Confederate states. In 1511, the Swiss opted to appease France and Austria by staying neutral in their disputes.
There is a big lie, the lie of neutrality. First of all, the Second World War was not just any war. It was not just one of thousands of other conflicts in the long history of our continent. It was a crime against humanity. It was the fight between civilization and barbarism. And Hitler was not just a chief of state or a general making war to some other country. He was the incarnation of evil. He was a mass murderer. It was a criminal regime from the top to the base. So to be neutral in such a case, to when humanity is fighting for its survival, this attitude is criminal. It's totally intolerable.
Je ne pense pas qu'on puisse dire.
I don't think that we could say that the whole country got richer.
Si vous voulez, il a eu l'immense privilège.
It has had the great privilege to avoid being invaded, to live relatively normally compared to its neighbors.
Ses voisins.
The Swiss banks, they made an immense amount of money out of this relationship with the Reich. And the planetary power of the Swiss banks, which you can see today, comes from the days of the Second World War. So they had this immensely profitable business relation with Berlin. So when the Reichssicherheitsamt asked something from their business friends, they were very inclined to give it as to keep up business.
The Allies also colluded in the matter that by pretending that Switzerland was truly neutral, for one simple reason. It was useful for them as well.
Indeed, Switzerland did provide a useful site for diplomatic exchanges, intelligence gathering, and financial dealings among allies, Axis, and neutrals. Alan Dulles led the European Office of Strategic Services in Europe, the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency in Bern. His Swiss office was the main source of information for the Allies in Europe. Another clear asset for the Allies was their reliance on the Swiss-operated International Committee of the Red Cross to protect Allied airmen who were shot down over Central Europe. German espionage networks in Switzerland were quite elaborate in their organization. The Nazis used German residents of Switzerland for their espionage work, and the Swiss could do little to deter such activities for fear of provoking and antagonizing Germany. Moreover, during these unsettling times for Switzerland, Swiss banks provided necessary financial intermediation for the Allies. The Julius Baer Bank was a small private bank owned by a Jewish family. It assisted the OSS by arranging for the foreign exchange the organization required for many of its operations.
The Allies were themselves doing business in Switzerland. Let's remember that Alan Dulles, sitting in Bern, was able, through Swiss banks, to finance the French resistance.
Such acts point to the anti-Nazi sentiment that prevailed among the Swiss people.
I think that 99% of the Swiss were against Hitler.
The resistance against Nazi Germany in Switzerland, the grassroots resistance, was rather stronger in Switzerland than in any other country in Europe, for a very simple historical fact. It is that Switzerland has been created against the German Empire.
Switzerland was not alone in doing business with the Germans. Other neutral countries cooperated with Hitler, most significantly Vichy France. Turkey bought Nazi gold, as did Sweden. Francisco Franco's Spain considered entering the war on the side of the Axis powers, but could not reach a deal with Hitler on Spain's access to the spoils of war following an Axis victory. Instead, Franco aided Germany by buying stolen gold from Europe's national treasuries via Switzerland. Juan Antonio Salazar's Portugal also enjoyed economic gain by doing business with the Nazis via Switzerland. And Juan Perón's Argentina, which became a haven for Nazis after the war, buzzed with rumors of U-boats delivering gold to the port of Mar del Plata.
What these central banks in Spain, Portugal, Sweden, or Turkey would say is, we don't want to deal directly with the Reichsbank. So the Swiss National Bank, the Central Bank of Switzerland, would be the clearinghouse, then selling gold to various third parties.
As the tide of the war turned against the Germans following their failed siege of Stalingrad, the voracious appetite for capital and property continued. As Hitler's feast was coming to an end, he was still obsessed with the stolen art treasures.
What is really interesting is that, let's say, in the middle of the war, in the middle of defeat, in the middle of persecution, in the middle of being vanquished, and being also completely disheveled psychologically, when he writes his testament, his will, at the end of the war, he still talks about this collection.
The war had become a second priority to Hitler and the SS. With their armies in retreat, the Nazis accelerated their quest for the spoils of war. There were plenty of Swiss financial intermediaries willing to assist in laundering and hiding the fruits of Nazi pillaging. Switzerland was providing government trade credits to the Reich while it manufactured war material for the German military.
Who went on with producing, and furnishing the Reich with locomotives, with arms, with precision instruments, with optical instruments, and kept on going the war.
The entry of the United States into the war and the failure of Germany to obtain a decisive victory over the Soviet Union put increasing pressure on Switzerland to appear more neutral than it had become. But this image was difficult to change, since German forces still surrounded Switzerland and certain Swiss banks continued to launder looted gold and accept secret deposits by Nazi leaders. Before the United States entered the war, its Department of Treasury issued a policy to curb Swiss economic support of the Third Reich in 1941. Swiss firms suspected of doing business with the Nazis were blacklisted, and their Swiss assets were frozen in the U.S.
It's important to underscore that, unlike the case with other neutrals who began to sense around the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad is a commonly identified landmark. The other neutrals began to assess that Germany might not win the war after all and began to pull back from their relationship with the Germans. The Swiss were reluctant, and they continued on into 1943, despite the spectacular Allied victories in North Africa, which ought to have been a signal, despite the collapse of Mussolini in Italy, which ought to have been a signal. On and on they continued, and they were doing very well.
The U.S. was determined to put an end to the trafficking of looted gold by the neutrals and signed international treaties and declarations with its allies to ensure that title to any property, gold, or other assets obtained through economic plunder would not be recognized after the war. Agents of the U.S. Department of the Treasury vigorously conducted a worldwide hunt known as Operation Safe Haven, to uncover, control, and prevent the sale and disappearance of German property and valuables once the war finally came to an end. A dark suspicion remained that the remnants of the Nazi leadership would use secret funds deposited in neutral countries as a means of establishing a Fourth Reich.
That was a central concern in 1945, to make sure that Nazi Germany wouldn't revive with the aid of resources that were deposited in Swiss banks.
So there was at the 10th of August 1944 this mysterious conference the SS convoked in Strasbourg to prepare the resurrection of a Fourth Reich, with or without Hitler, and to assure the flight of the principal leaders, of the principal criminals.
The loot pillaged by the Nazis over 5 years of war and 12 years of dictatorship was now spread throughout Europe. Some even traveled as far as South America. As the Allies captured the retreating German military forces, caches of gold were found across Germany and Austria. Uncovered were gems, artwork, jewelry, gold fillings, industrial patents, and other assets stolen by the Nazis. In the closing days of the war, American troops discovered gold reserves in the salt mines of Merkers and in the Buchenwald concentration camp. The gold from Merkers and other Nazi sources was valued at $200 million. The U.S., Britain, and France formed a commission to evaluate how to redistribute gold back to those countries whose central banks had been looted. But where was the balance of the gold stolen from the 10 central banks of Europe, estimated to be worth some $621 million at the time? The focus turned to Switzerland. The Allies could not agree on a common strategy to deal with the Swiss. The UK and France needed trade credits and national loans to jumpstart their respective post-war economies. The US was concerned that the rest of Europe, lying in ruins, could fall prey to a communist takeover. There was even concern that Switzerland would begin buying Siberian gold from Moscow, bringing them within the communist sphere of influence. In addition, the American government was shifting politically.
Truman was in power, and the Cold War was just starting. In March 1946, Switzerland was invited very strongly to Washington as the accomplice of Hitler. Hitler was dead since 1 year, and then the Allies, they said, now you have to render account. You have to explain your behavior and give back what stolen money there is in your bank vaults, especially the Nazi gold. They negotiated 68 days up till May 1946. And they lied like hell, I'm sorry to say. They lied in the most cynical way. They said, what should we, reparations, Swiss reparations? We don't want to do it. We are neutral. We never were allied to any one of the parties in the conflict. Why should we give reparations and so on and so on?
The Washington Agreement between the US, UK, and France on behalf of all the Allies and Switzerland was signed in May 1946. The government of Switzerland agreed to return 250 million Swiss francs, approximately $52 million worth of gold, to the Allies to distribute to the central banks that were looted by the Nazis. In exchange, all national claims against Switzerland were to be dropped and no further claims would be pressed. Strangely, the Washington Accord never attributed guilt or liability to the Swiss. Instead, it stated that Switzerland was merely making a financial contribution to the economic reconstruction of Europe.
After the war, when they had all of this information from Safe Haven, the Allies chose to largely ignore a lot of it when they were hammering out treaties with Switzerland. The Washington Accord is the most important of that. And they chose not to press Switzerland even though they had all of this information, because by the end of the war, Britain and France knew that they needed Swiss banks in order to restart their economies, which were shattered as a result of the war. And so they put a lot of pressure on the United States not to use the Safe Haven documentation to punish Switzerland. Essentially, it allowed the Swiss to get away with murder.
The books of the Swiss National Bank and the Switzerland-based Bank of International Settlements, another bank associated with laundering Nazi gold, were never opened to the Allies. To this day, only a few Swiss bankers know how much stolen gold was laundered through Switzerland.
The money that Switzerland returned to the Allies did not involve money that had been expropriated from individuals. There was a side letter to the Washington Accord saying that Switzerland would have to do its utmost to get the money that had deposited in its banks back to those people, those individuals who had made those deposits before and during the war. Except that nothing happened for years.
After the war, little was done for individuals seeking restitution for their lost assets, homes, personal belongings, and artwork. The world had just entered the nuclear age, and the Allies were contending with a new kind of war with the Soviets, their former comrades in arms. The map of Europe was quickly being divided between the two power blocs. The Allies showed little interest in assisting individuals, so it was no surprise that the Swiss government and their commercial banks followed suit.
Switzerland didn't really pay attention to individual claims. I mean, you've got Holocaust survivors going back to Switzerland with little documentation, knowing that their families perhaps had Swiss bank accounts, and Swiss banking officials being incredibly nasty and asking them in a very legalistic way, well, we need a death certificate. And their response was always, well, Auschwitz didn't issue death certificates.
Claims for personal assets after the war became a bureaucratic nightmare.
Even if the descendant of a Holocaust victim could produce what we call a declaration of disappearance, the banking clerk would ask, now prove me that you are the only heir that you are the only hire. And as the SS monster killed whole families, whole villages, whole cities, this second proof, you could never produce it. You could never produce it. And this is a denial of justice, produced by the banking secrecy, because now the banks are turning the banking secrecy against the client, which is a very perverse way of applying an existing law.
The Swiss government and the country's financial institutions struggled to come to grips with a newly focused attention on their country's banking practices during and following the war. In addition, the return of artwork stolen by the Nazis during their occupation of France had been no easy matter. With post-war Europe on the verge of mass starvation, the Allies did not put the return of art plundered by the Nazis on their list of post-war priorities.
The Allies did start tracking this art, and they started knowing about it very slowly during the war. But in fact, they knew the dimension, the proportions of it only after 44, 45, once Paris is liberated, and they realized everything that had been stolen. The official policy in France, there was a denial phase. Many of these people felt that the 50 years, that 40, 50 years after the war, they could talk. Some of them even told me, you know, I was just so happy after the war to have survived that I didn't even dare ask for material things. But now they realize that art is not only a material thing, it goes beyond that, and they're trying to recover it.
Only since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union have there been worldwide efforts to expose the lack of individual justice and address restitution of economic crimes that occurred during World War II. With the passing of the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, there's been renewed interest in the whereabouts of individual assets, sparking a number of inquiries and discoveries across Europe. In 1995, the Austrian government returned artworks stolen by the Nazis for which there were no heirs. For over 5 decades, the works had been stored at a monastery in Mauerbach, collecting dust. Ownership of the art was transferred to the Austrian Jewish community, which, with Christie's, organized an auction in Vienna in October of 1996 to raise money for a variety of charities and Holocaust education trusts. The Swiss banks, however, have been slower in dealing with their nation's activities during the Second World War. When the U.S. government declassified a number of military intelligence documents concerning the role of Switzerland, the Swiss National Bank, and its commercial banks and financial intermediaries, the American press began to take a keen interest in the issue. So did World Jewish Congress President Edgar Bronfman Sr. and U.S. Senator Alphonse D'Amato, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. Bronfman Sr. and Senator D'Amato accused the Swiss government and Swiss banking industry of profiting from the Holocaust and withholding bank accounts worth an estimated $7 billion from their rightful owners. Others believe that these estimates were inflated.
I would be extremely suspicious of anyone who assumes that we can have an accurate accounting now of the, quote, billions of dollars or Swiss francs in assets stolen from Jews or stolen from occupied countries, or for that matter, anyone who assumes that we can have an accurate inventory of works of art that were taken.
I think that Jewish people, having brought money to Switzerland, seeing the invasion of European country by the Nazi, they decided to bring it to England or to the US. That's a That's all. These are the reasons why I suppose, I repeat, I suppose, that all the sums involved are not very important.
Regardless of the estimated value of the dormant bank accounts, political events continued to drive the issue. The Swiss parliament launched its own inquiry in December 1996. A commission of experts was appointed to review mountains of archival material to determine Switzerland's role in the laundering of Nazi gold and looted property.
It happens very rarely that Parliament adopts a law by unanimity. This has been the case in both chambers, so our Commission has, I think, a very solid political basis in Switzerland. I think from the moment on where this Commission has been established by the Parliament, private persons and private enterprises, corporate enterprises, have understood the message, and they, until now, they cooperate really very willingly with us.
Il est très difficile d'évaluer la marge.
It is very difficult to assess Switzerland's acting margin at the time. I think it depended a lot with time. According to me, this margin was very limited during the summer of 1940. And although I think that Switzerland could have, of course it is easy to say it could have been more open, more critical despite everything, at least during the second part of the war. It has tried to slightly limit its economic allowances, but I think it could have done more. And above all, and it's a big point for me, it could have politically done more regarding the welcoming of Jewish refugees during World War II. Here, it had an acting margin that seems quite obvious to me, and it could have done better in this field. We cannot be the Red Cross country that gives of itself a generous idea if at the same time our attitude is as closed as it was at that time.
Aussi importante que la Suisse l'a fait.
The entire affair became a public relations nightmare for Switzerland.
They are sitting on this country, impenetrable to any moral argument, you know. They say we are people apart, we are neutral, we do not care about the wars around us, the conflicts around us, the misery around us. We do business with everybody, be it Mr. Hitler, be it. And this institutionalized blindness is the biggest problem of Switzerland today.
Questions also remain about the whereabouts of thousands of the world's great pieces of art.
We have to remember that there's still about 20% of all the art looted in France that's still missing. So I believe that part of it must be somewhere in Switzerland, but that if we are patient enough, it will come up. What is interesting is that many of these artworks, much of this artwork, once it was looted and disappeared, it disappeared for a few years. But then, of course, it naturally came to North America, to the United States especially, because that was where the market was. A lot of these looted paintings, they all come from France, because France was the biggest looted place. And so a lot of them, you can really trace them from the place where they were looted, down to the Jeu de Paume, then to Switzerland, and then to the United States.
Are there any legitimate rules about what spoils of war are legitimate? That's a kind of question that's basically an oxymoron, because you're dealing with war, which at its essence is an immoral enterprise, because its objective is to kill as many people as you can possibly do, and whether they're soldiers or civilians, that difference, which formerly was observed to some degree, is now generally no longer observed. I do know that the Nazis observed nothing.
Let's remember that these assets were stolen in a time in which there were desperate people making desperate arrangements, and in which there were at the same time some of the most brilliant minds in the banking world turning their energies and their talents to covering up. Now, assuming now that we can go back and provide an accurate accounting, I think this is highly dubious.
Considering the amount of time that has passed since World War II, the true economic loss is certainly hard to grasp. Recovery of the valuable assets stolen from individual Europeans by the Third Reich is scarcely guaranteed. Moreover, simply attributing a monetary figure to this restitution would probably be an injustice to the victims of Nazism. The chilling methods the Nazi regime employed to rob Europe and its people of artwork, money, property, and other assets have become more clear. But the precise amount of Nazi gold and their assorted spoils of war may remain a mystery forever.